I'm switched on. Good afternoon. Maybe all the people, I think we've stopped now the main session, so whoever's interested, very welcome to join us here for our fireside chat. See, people coming, very good. I think we're just going to start, and I hope we're going to be filling the seats and people standing in the back listening. That'd be great. Well, thank you very much. Welcome. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to our first series of Fireside Chats Engaging Minds on drug policy. My name is Doris, and I'm very excited that I'll be moderating today's session. We've gathered over the next 3 days a line of excellent experts that all have a very unique perspective on drug policy to contribute. And as the C&D is moving towards the 2024 midterm review, we tried as Secretariat to organize these informal dialogues to support stakeholder engagements and make sure there is space for different views, different opinions, and different perspectives on drug policy. We'll be holding 3 sessions this week, so I hope you're going to join us for all 3. It's going to be each day from 1 to 2 here in the common area. We're going to be talking today with civil society. Tomorrow we're going to talk with the scientific community. And on Wednesday we're going to talk with our young representatives. I want to have the audience be part of the discussion, so it's really important that you ask questions. We have 2 excellent experts here. So we'll make sure that we leave sufficient room for your questions. And I also want to extend a welcome to those joining us online. We're streaming this session, so hopefully some of them are also following us online. So joining me today for this first session is Secretary General of the World Federation Against Drugs, Regina Madsen. The World Federation Against Drugs has over 420 member organizations in 68 countries, and the network shares the aims to strengthen prevention, increase access to treatment, and to promote recovery. Welcome, Regina. Nice to have you. Also joining us today is Steve Rose, Senior Policy Analyst at Transform Drug Policy Foundation. Transform is a UK-based independent think tank focusing on drug policy reform, including just and effective systems of legal regulations of drugs. Welcome, Steve. Thanks for joining.
My pleasure.
So I think to start, I think it would be really nice. I mean, I'm sure some of those experts here are no strangers to our audience when we're discussing drug policy. But I think it'd be really nice that you introduce yourself a little bit to our audience and also explain a little bit of what's your area of advocacy, what you're working on in drug policy. So Regina, if you want to start first, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having us, both of us. We've had really good preparatory discussions leading up to today, so I'm sure that we'll have a lot to talk about today as well. Like Doris mentioned, I represent WFAD, which is a global umbrella organizations and individuals. And we share these common concerns, and there are these common aims to strengthen prevention, increase access to treatment, and to promote recovery. And beyond that, we put special emphasis on the rights and the needs of women and children within our field. And that means that we not only work based on the UN Drug Control Conventions, but also the CEDAW Convention and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And the work that we do, I would say, is in 3 different pillars. So on one hand, it is advocacy, where we do try to promote these aspects in a continuum of care and recovery-oriented systems of care. We also work with capacity strengthening for our members, and that means trainings, workshops, but also global and regional forums. And the 3rd pillar is really projects. So we do projects together with our members, working directly with beneficiaries through different funding opportunities, mostly Swedish development cooperation aid. And we have projects like that in the DRC, in the Western Balkans, in India, Georgia, and a couple of other places. Yes, so really, I mean, because we're organization or a network of organizations, our ultimate goal is to harness that power and the expertise of civil society from around the globe in anything that we do. So anything that I say today, I will try to do so on behalf of all of our members, which means that I can say a lot, but not everything, where the views of our members differ. But really, our main goals are strengthening prevention, and that means early detection. It means having these very impressive prevention programs that are evidence-based, gender-sensitive, age-appropriate, and contextualized. Strengthening care and treatments, offering that support, which includes as well harm reduction services for those who need that in that continuum of care, and of course recovery services and reintegration. So a recovery-oriented system of care is one of our main sort of goals in which we bank on.
So you already touched upon a couple of topics like evidence-based and contextualizing. So some of the things we're also going to be looking in a little more detail in our discussion today. Regina, tell me, or would you share with the audience what kind of motivated you to start working on drug policy, or how did it happen that you started to be an advocate for drug policy?
Sure. Well, one of my colleagues usually say that I'm brought up in the school of recovery. Within the space where I grew up, it was a lot of active addiction. I've lost a lot of friends to overdose deaths. But I've also had a mother who's been working within this area for a long time with social enterprises to provide work opportunities for people that stand outside of the regular labor market. So I spent my summers and holidays and everything working extra there. So I was kind of brought into the system already before I could make the decision myself. And like I mentioned before, I truly believe that a lot of the social issues that we're facing today, a lot of the inequalities and the discrimination are due to the policies that we have in place. And as a social worker, I got tired of putting out fires and wanted to change the structures that create these problems for people. So really, that's why.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Over to you, Steve. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do and where you come from in terms of drug policy?
Sure. So Transform Drug Policy Foundation was set up in the late 1990s, and our focus has very much been not only to critique what we see as the failings of contemporary drug policy, but to try and look to the future and propose a vision of how we think the future can deliver better outcomes on all of our shared goals. We very much seek to improve and protect public health, to improve and protect human rights, to focus on sustainable development and issues around social justice. And we think that the current status quo is not delivering on those things, and the data shows that very clearly. But beyond a growing consensus that there's something wrong with contemporary drug policy, both in the UK where we're based, but globally where we also operate on the international stage. We've particularly focused on the problems of illegal markets and prohibition and the so-called war on drugs, and how we think we need to move beyond that we need to not only end the criminalization of people who use drugs, but also explore options for alternatives to prohibition, so legally regulated markets for currently illegal drugs. And to that end, we've spent many years and a good deal of time and expertise working with key experts and stakeholders around the world to try and develop coherent, pragmatic models for the legal regulation of drugs, different drugs in different environments, different using behaviors, with a sound basis in public health. And we've published a series of books and briefings, and we do advocacy around the world in a range of policy forums on the basis of that work. And all of our books and reports are available freely on our website, so please do check them out if you're interested. There are different elements to the work. We also support incremental reforms in terms of innovative harm reduction, decriminalization, diversion. And we also do public-facing campaigns. We have an initiative called Anyone's Child, which is families who've been impacted by both drugs and drug enforcement, telling their stories and advocating for reform. It's been an interesting journey. We started off as more of an advocacy and policy organization, but as legal regulation has started to become a reality, particularly around cannabis stuff in recent years, we've moved significantly to a kind of consultative role, working with a number of governments around the world, trying to advise on best practice. And that's kind of where we are now. The cannabis regulation debate is clearly up and running on multiple continents in multiple jurisdictions. It's a very controversial and challenging issue for many different political actors, but it is happening, and hopefully we can inform it in a kind of sensible, evidence-based, sort of public health, pragmatic way, and hopefully make sure that when governments and other political entities do make that change, that they do so in a positive, pragmatic way that can help realize our shared goals and the goals of the UN Charter and the goals of the treaties, at least in as far as the health and well-being of humankind. So that's where we're up to, and if people are interested in the detail of that work, you can check out the Transform website.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And I think we might also leave some room for questions from the audience on basically both of the areas that we've just heard. I think I'd love to touch on a couple of issues, because both of you mentioned certain keywords that were similar. We were talking about the social circumstances, how we can work there. And I mean, drug policy, we've discussed it also before a little bit when we had a coffee. It has a lot of areas where you have different views, but there might also be some very core areas that are basically similar, or where we could also join forces. And I mean, here also in the Commission, we see different policies, we have different opinions. So it's not just between member states, but is of course also within civil society. So, and I would like to just take a moment here to reflect maybe how we can, find some common ground on these differences, and, what are these differences maybe a challenge, but also maybe an opportunity, especially if we talk drug policy. So, Steve, what do you think? What are some of the maybe the core values we can all agree, or what are some of the challenges or opportunities in that field?
I mean, I think we all share the core kind of UN Charter goals of peace and security and human rights and health and well-being and sustainable development. We're all trying to get to the same place. I think there's a general acknowledgement that there are problems with a lot of drug policy around the world, and change is needed to improve the outcomes. I mean, you can read the World Drug Report over successive years, and it makes for it's pretty grim reading. And that's not even reading the civil society reports, which are often, more critical and go into areas that perhaps the World Drug Report doesn't go into so much, like issues around human rights. But then you can look at other UN publications, like the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights report on human rights and drug policy recently. It's pretty grim stuff. So clearly, change is needed to improve the outcomes. In many cases, I think there's a general agreement. We need more resources for public health, whether that's prevention, whether that's treatment, whether that's harm reduction. There's clearly shortcomings on funding to scale up evidence-based public health interventions. I think there's an agreement that we need to look at some of the underlying drivers of problematic drug use: inequality, poverty, alienation, childhood trauma. A lot of these things get overlooked because we have these sort of symptomatic band-aid responses. If we're really serious about dealing with problematic drug use and risky drug use, we need to deal with the underlying social drivers of that. And it's a difficult time in the world: conflict, climate change, a lot of strife around the world, and that can be fueling problematic drug use, inequality, poverty, and so on. So I think there's agreement on that. Where there's disagreement is around some of the solutions. So obviously, issues around decriminalization have been controversial, but increasingly less so. Issues around regulation of cannabis and other drugs is particularly controversial, but those debates are happening, and I think it's important that they are had. I mean, there are differences of opinion between member states on regulation, there are differences of opinion within civil society, and increasingly there are differences of opinion within the UN agencies itself. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has, in their recent report, called on member states to explore options for regulation. That's not a position that's held yet by other member states. There used to be differences of opinion on decriminalization of people who use drugs, i.e. not giving criminal records and arresting and prosecuting and punishing people use drugs. There's now a broad consensus between the UN agencies on that, and increasingly I think there's a consensus within civil society. So it shows to me that dialogue and constructive engagement positions can evolve. You know, the World Federation Against Drugs position on decriminalisation and harm reduction has, you know, evolved and grown, and the positions of other organisations on prevention has also evolved. So dialogue, sharing experiences, sharing information and best practice is absolutely crucial. So that's why I think these sorts of dialogues and these sorts of events where civil society and member states from different positions are talking to each other, even if there are disagreements, generally that's going to help things move forward, and I think it's very positive.
Great, thank you, Steve. Maybe, Regina, if you can also, on the values that Steve mentioned and these differences where we can also draw something positive out of that, maybe you can also elaborate on that a little.
Sure. Well, I mean, thank you, Steve and Doris. First of all, from WFAD's side, we do believe in the need for more humane drug policies, but we believe in finding these options without opening up for legalization, for example. So that's, I mean, one of the main aspects and where we differ. But like you say, Steve, there are certain aspects that civil society really can come together on and have these common positions. From my side, I would say gender is one such thing. I mean, for a long time, we forgot about women within our space. Now, you know, a few years ago, 2019, I believe there was very few side events or very few mentions on women and the barriers and access to health or treatment, for example. And now today we see that in, you know, almost a majority of side events during CND. We see it in a lot of the member states' presentations, and we see it in the World Drug Report, this data disaggregated by gender. And I think that's one of the main achievements from civil society, where we've been able to work together to really promote you know, these issues that we can find common positions on, and that goes not only for incorporating women and gender-sensitive treatment, trauma-informed treatment as well, but also when it comes to children. I would say that most of us would agree to try to prevent the onset addiction or dependency among children, or the onset use. And we do have the Convention on the Rights of the Child that almost all states have signed or ratified, and it really is the only human rights convention that specifically addresses illicit drug use, and it does hold member states obligated to prevent and protect children from the use, the trafficking and the selling of illicit drugs. And I think that when it comes to protecting our young people, our children, and to have non-discriminatory services for all those people who need them, I think civil society really has come together on those aspects. And like you say, I mean, evidence-based, you know, evidence sharing, the new research that's coming out, being able to speak to one another, not having these very polarized situations where we don't come together, but really this fireside chat is a good showcase of how we can talk and really learn from one another and see where we can agree, where we can collaborate and try to make a positive change.
Yes,
So,
go ahead.
yeah. So on that point of child's rights, I mean, obviously we share the goal of protecting the health and well-being of children and young people. I guess our point of view when it comes to some of these issues is that access to harm reduction is also a right, that children should have access to effective harm reduction as well as prevention and other forms of treatment. But also it's our view that the status quo, prohibition and illegal drug markets have not protected children. The outcomes in terms of child health under that system, under that framework, have got progressively worse over many generations, going all the way back to 1961. Illegal markets often target and exploit children to work in them. Children and young people who do use drugs face greater risks because they don't know what they're using and they don't have access to information. And children are often on the front line of drug market-related violence that is fueled by the war on drugs and prohibition and cartels and so on. So, this is an example of where there may be some disagreement. Our view is that prohibition has imperiled and endangered young people and has not protected them, and that responsible regulation of those markets, taking them away from organised crime groups and bringing them under regulation, would offer opportunities to better protect the health and well-being of children and young people. So again, I think it's an interesting and instructive example of where we can have a shared goal, but there may be differences of opinion on the detail about how to realise it.
Yeah, I think that was very well summarized. We have some very common goals of moving forward, be it gender, be it on the child's right, but there are different ways of getting there. You wanted to add something on this. Please feel free, go ahead. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, I think this is really, I guess, the core of where we disagree. The ultimate goal is perhaps the same, to protect young people and to ensure that they can develop into healthy, have healthy and safe environments, develop and grow into, adults in a positive way. You see the prohibition is the fault here, and I see the lack of social infrastructure. In many of the places where we've seen an increase of social structures, not only in investing in prevention services, in harm reduction services, but also that treatment and referrals and counseling, and really mapping not only the public space and what's available for children, youth, and adults, but also within civil society where we can support one another. Strengthening that is where our sort of, solution lies. More so than legalizing.
No, I mean, hello.
More not at all.
No. The thing is, and this is good because I can just agree wholeheartedly with what you just said. But I don't think legalization is the only part of the solution. But I think that prohibition is one of the structural drivers of risk to children and young people related to drugs and drug markets. And part of the solution is what you just said, all the various social and institutional things that we need to do, but part of it is also getting rid of a harmful legacy of, a failed legal and institutional structure that goes back to the middle or early last century. It was devised in a different era. It's not proved effective. It's not working. It's actively counterproductive, and that's part of the solution. So I don't see legalization regulation as the only solution or as a silver bullet. It clearly isn't, but for us it's part of the solution. And getting rid of it is an enabler of the very things that you said. If we get rid of these obstacles, we can do those things, those social health, public health interventions more effectively. That's
if I may just draw in here, and because we were now talking about new strategies, different strategies, maybe not one strategy being the silver bullet, as you mentioned, I want to throw in there the concept of how does that work in all parts of the world? Because of the UN, we have all member states here. So if we're talking about the of how we can actually tailor these strategies to the different local contexts, because some of the strategies that are being proposed might be looking at a success story from a very specific place, so very contextualized. So if you look at making sure that this works everywhere in the world, is that possible? Or maybe Steve, because you started on these, how does that work? Does that work in every country? Is this the solution to the issue?
I mean, I think it's very clear that that there is no one-size-fits-all drug policy solution. Drug policies have to be responsive to the cultural environment, the drug-using behaviours, the economic and political environment, the legal environment, and many other things. So you can have overarching principles around best practice and sustainable development and human rights and evidence-based good practice, but the detail has to be determined locally and not even necessarily nationally. I mean, even within national jurisdictions, there may be there will be different cultural needs and different responses needed. And if you look at drug policy around the world, there's enormous variation. You have places in the US where you can just walk into a shop and buy, an ounce of cannabis completely legally, and there are other places in the world where you would literally get executed for doing that, certainly for selling that ounce of cannabis. So there's enormous variation. Different member states are at very different points on the sort of path of drug policy reform. different points on the spectrum, from a kind of full-on, ferociously punitive war on drugs, all the way to the more kind of liberal decriminalization, legalization models, and everything in between. And I think, we have to be nuanced enough to be able to respond to that variation and complexity and engage with different jurisdictions where they are. And I don't think you would expect to rock up to Saudi Arabia and say, why haven't you legalized cocaine yet? Obviously, that would be ridiculous. Reform is going to be an incremental process of small steps towards achieving our kind of public health and human rights goals. But, again, dialogue, sharing best practice, sharing experiences, even though they're not necessarily directly transferable between jurisdictions, broad lessons, broad understanding, the more dialogue, the more information sharing we have, the better.
Thank you so much, Steve. On this point, maybe Regina, I know you come from this umbrella organization, so you have a lot of different organizations in a lot of parts of the world. So maybe you can also draw a little bit from these different realities that your member organizations are maybe contributing to your discussions, or maybe how, does your federation or you in your work maybe go about these different realities when you advocate for different policies?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, really based on the regional perspective, to be short, we have members in all of the world regions, in 68 countries, and the realities differ widely. I mean, I myself am from Sweden, and that's a completely different reality than some colleagues that I have in the state of Kerala in India, for example, where the ages of onset drug use is going down to about 7-8 years of age, and they're facing completely different struggles than I would be facing perhaps in my local community in Sweden, where the environment has a very serious impact now that the ocean is rising, and it's creating difficulties, and it's impoverishing whole communities. And really, that's why it's so important to base everything that we say in policy on the realities and the expertise of our members. Because, I mean, I can't go, barely anywhere outside my own community and say this is how this should be done. But we really need community ownership and to, voice the reality of the situation on the ground, and be it, in research, in monitoring and evaluating existing projects, but also on the basis of the knowledge that our members have. And I would say that in terms of these realities, some countries don't have any type of drug policy. They don't have any type of child rights policy, but what they have are the conventions of the UN. And that's why these conventions are still so important. I mean, they're still important in all areas, but particularly where, national policies are lacking. And that's where we try to support our members, to support their governments, to develop these policies that really integrate a comprehensive approach to the drug problem, the world drug problem, or the national one. And I would say that, I mean, this might be a bit, I don't know the word in English now. Okay, never mind, you'll understand what I mean, but I think that there's a huge problem that we talk about drug policy the way we do, often stemming from, white middle-class people from Europe.
Sorry.
Sorry. I mean, it's a huge problem because we do not represent the reality of the situation in the world. We barely represent the reality of the situation in our own countries because, let's face it, we're privileged enough to be here. We have an education probably. I mean, we've gotten to the point where we are. And so this localized information is the most important. And that's why I can say on behalf of our members that legalization in a situation in a low and middle income context, where there are policies lacking, there's a severe lack in social infrastructure, would cause more problems than good. And in those situations, we really need to bank on the CRC and make our voices heard to invest in prevention, because prevention is essential, but also that continuum of care, with harm reduction, treatment, reintegration, recovery, of course.
Not sure if you want to add something, but before you do, I would love to hear from someone in the audience if you do have a question. I'll let Steve respond first if you wish to add something. Okay, we already have the first question. So Steve, do you want to add something?
No, that's fine.
So please, if you have a question, You already got the mic, but please introduce yourself. Maybe someone in the back is not seeing you. And then just ask your question. Please, go ahead.
Thanks. Marie Nugier from the International Drug Policy Consortium. So thanks so much for the debate. It's really exciting. I have two questions. So one of them is around the objectives of drug policy and the whole issues with prohibition and why we want to question it in a way, because the main objective of prohibition was to eradicate drugs. I mean, here it comes over and over again. The objective is, create a society free of drug abuse. And I feel like this is something that is divisive, because at the end of the day, this objective has been incredibly harmful. So that's why I wanted to ask you both to reflect on that and what that means for the advocacy that we're doing as civil society. The second issue, Regina, is what you were just mentioning on regulation and how that could be harmful in communities that don't necessarily have the level of regulations that are necessary to put together a regulated market. What's interesting about this is that actually, IDPC is also a network, and we're collecting a lot of evidence and thoughts from all of the membership. And there's a lot of discussions on legal regulation, including from the farmers' communities, traditional farmers. And I'm not saying that all regulation would be positive, because we all know the dangers of corporate capture and the fact that traditional farmers could be completely pushed out of the regulatory system. However, regulation does constitute an opportunity for farmers to receive an entry point to the legal market and get out of, the illicit, organized crime kind of cycle. So if you could both reflect on that, that'd be also really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe Steve, we'll start with you as the first on the society free of drug abuse and the harm done, and the second.
I understand where the aspiration for a drug-free society comes. People see harms associated with drugs, and they think, well, if we get rid of drugs, then those harms will end. And I understand where that comes from, but it's not. It feels deeply unhelpful given the reality of the world we live in. There are. According to the UN, the UN ODC World Drug Report, 360 million people used drugs last year, a not insignificant number of people, and probably a conservative estimate. For me, policy has to be about dealing with reality, and the reality is, whether we like it or not, whether we morally approve of it, drug use to some extent is a reality in almost all societies, and it has, in many cases, it has been historically. And we have, as responsible policymakers and responsible civil society and citizens, to deal with that reality and manage it pragmatically to reduce the harms it causes and to deliver the outcomes on our shared goals that we've been talking about. And that's the basis for both our critique of the status quo and our calls for a shift towards a more public health and human rights-based approach. That includes changing the structures around criminalization and prohibition. Because, the status quo isn't working. We can't deliver a drug-free world. We can reduce harmful use. We can reduce use amongst vulnerable populations. Good evidence-based prevention can deliver on some of those. Good harm reduction can reduce harmful and high-risk behaviors. But we can't eradicate drugs. So, the overweening focus on creating a drug-free society is not just unrealistic, it's actively unhelpful. It's very problematic, and I can't remember what the second question was.
The second one was on the regulation also in the smaller communities, if I understood correctly, that there were different...
Right. This kind of comes back to the point you made earlier about one size fits all.
Yeah.
When people talk about legalizing cannabis or legalizing drugs, we're not talking about a single thing. Within that overarching category, there is actually a whole range of policy and practice, from very strictly regulated state monopolies or prescription models, all the way through to kind of laissez-faire, libertarian, free market models, and kind of everything in between. And with cannabis, for example, you see an enormous range of policy and practice, from the more commercial models in some US states to the kind of state monopoly model in Uruguay to the kind of halfway in between kind of model that we see in Canada. And some of the more public health models that are emerging now in Europe, like the Maltese model, where there are non-profit associations and home grow only, and no retail commercial market at all. So there is a whole range of policy and practice, and we need to look at that and learn and say, well, what's working and what isn't working, and be thinking about impacted communities. What about the traditional growers? What about the people, many millions of people who work in the illegal drug industry who aren't your kind of Pablo Escobar characters? The people who, it's a very hierarchical industry. You have a few very rich people at the top, and then a lot of people just sort of street dealers, traffickers, growers who are there. Essentially, it's more of a survival economy. They're there through lack of other opportunities, and it's a form of economic survival for many people, many marginalised people. Many people on the economic fringes of society are pushed into illicit markets out of need rather than greed, to use a phrase. And we absolutely need to be thinking about these. Regulation and the debate on regulation has to have a development focus, economic, social, cultural development focus. And we can't just abandon all these people to huge corporate entities of the kind we've seen with alcohol and tobacco, where 4 or 5 massive transnational corporations dominate the global market and can influence policy in all kinds of unhealthy ways. So there's an awful lot of discussions that need to be had. Once you say, okay, should we talk about legalization regulation, you then have to get into the weeds, into the detail about how you do it responsibly in ways that can help meet our goals. Because you can do, as with anything, as with prevention, treatment, harm reduction, you can do those things well or badly. And we need to be having the discussion, not just should we legalize and regulate, or should we move beyond prohibition, and should we decriminalize, but how do we decriminalize, how do we regulate in a responsible way? So these are really, really important discussions, and I feel like we're beginning to move into that space now. Not just should we do it, but how do we get it right? And that's where hopefully Transform and our colleagues in IDPC and international and other networks, including WFAD, can, I think, usefully inform that discussion for policymakers.
I think it was also very interesting, the point you made, and I think that's very similar to what Regina said, is also to build around that infrastructure. You were mentioning with the smaller farmers, we need to make sure that the infrastructure is also there, that they do, that they basically also have an option to move on this. Regina, do you want to?
Sure. Thank you. I'll try to remember the questions. I'll start with the last one. We support alternative development methods, so supporting those growers to work within illicit, crop cultivation that isn't illicit drugs, and still we do not aim for that legalization, and that goes for all of our members. I mean, that's one thing I can say for certain, And in terms of a drug-free society, I mean, this will sound maybe foolish, but aren't we aiming for a world free from hunger, a world free from gender-based violence? I mean, these aren't maybe set as a clear goal from which we seek to obtain in full, but it creates a framework within which we're, organizations on all sides have been trying their best, and then we can talk about how well that's gone, but their best to strive to prevent or delay the use of drugs and the development of problematic drug use and dependency. And that's really our goal. We do not see, a part of doing that is to create, as a community, as adults, but also as civil society, together with governments, to strengthen protective factors in place around individuals, around families, schools, communities, and society at large. And through that, strengthening our protective factors, we're aiming that less people will develop problematic drug use and addiction, but still people will get there, and we aim to make sure that there are accessible services, non-discriminatory services that support people on their recovery journeys, so if they so should choose that. And in terms of legalization, that's one of the aspects where we're starting to get some research outcomes. We've seen from Colorado, for example, and some other states that some of those main arguments that have been used historically, we're going to remove the illicit market, we're going to have less costs for the law enforcement, and so on. This hasn't really been the case in full, not at least to that extent that was promised by those promoting legalization. But what is really the problem that we see here is that with legalization comes a normalization, and this normalization leads to young people and their perceived risk of these drugs decreasing. And we saw that in the World Drug Report last year, right? That the perceived risk of cannabis among youth is decreasing. And so we're normalizing something that can have potential really harmful consequences on the developing brain, on their life at large, and especially, if our goal, which is our goal, is to protect children and youth, that's a negative consequence big enough alone to say no to legalization, so to speak. And then again, no one size fits all, right? I mean, Sweden is known for, prohibition, but in reality, I mean, there are virtually barely any people that are going to jail for drug use possession. You get a fine. You get fines in a lot of the countries where they've decriminalized possession. You get support in that services, and what we can see is that drug use among young people in Sweden has remained quite low. We do have problems, especially with overdose deaths, and for that, WFAD, for example, we talk about distributing naloxone, and we want preventive measures. We want to make sure to have alternatives to incarceration, and a good Samaritan law to really support people preventing people from rendering in that position where they don't feel comfortable calling the police or the ambulance, for example. I don't know. I don't know if I answered all your questions, Marie. You can.
Can I come back on a couple?
Yes. Let me just see if someone has a question. Please think about the question. You can already raise your hand, and we'll give you the microphone. I'll let you come back on this. Yeah. Just quickly, please. Go ahead, Steve.
I mean, it's interesting, and I don't want to go dive into having a kind of argument on, well, this is my data and this is your data, but it's a reality that there's a lot of data created on a lot of different indicators, whether it's health, whether it's crime, whether it's expenditure, whether it's seizures, blah blah blah, and it's easy for people with a particular position, whether that's in favor of regulation or a particular policy reform or against it, to trawl through the data and find data that supports their position. And clearly no policy is going to have amazing outcomes on everything. And it's quite difficult to cut through all of that data complexity and tease out lessons. But people do try and do it, and I think there are kind of independent voices and so on, that independent analysis that you can turn to, that wouldn't be seen as sort of legalization propaganda, wouldn't be seen as kind of anti-drug stuff. I mean, I think but on one point I did want to pick up is about the reduction in the size of the illegal market. If you look at somewhere like Canada, about 60 to 65% of that market has now moved into the legal, regulated and taxed space. Now, that's not 100%, but it's 65% better than 100% criminal and controlled by organized crime and unregulated dealers. So I would view that as progress. You could probably go to Canada and say, well, look, here are some other outcomes which aren't so good. Here's an increase in use or problematic use amongst a particular demographic. Here's an increase in potency of products. So not all of the outcomes are good, but what we can do as pragmatic policymakers is we can look at the outcomes from these different jurisdictions that have adopted these different models, and we can learn from them. Because yes, there's about 15 different jurisdictions have now legalized and regulated cannabis. There's about 600 million people living in jurisdictions that have either regulated cannabis or are in the process of implementing legally regulated cannabis. So there's actually quite a lot of it going on at the moment, and we can look at that and learn what's working, what isn't working. And we need to be open and honest where it's not working and call it out. And I agree there are problems with some of the cannabis regulation models, and we need to point to it, and we need to be critical of that. We can't be uncritical of policy failings, whether it's something ideologically we approve of or not. And just as a final point on that, I think what would be really useful is if we had some normative guidance on best practice in cannabis regulation from the World Health Organization, who already provide exactly that kind of normative guidance on good regulation for recreational use of alcohol and tobacco, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the World Health Organization guidance on alcohol regulation. This is exactly the kind of sensible, pragmatic, evidence-based regulation we need for cannabis, because at the moment jurisdictions are barreling into it without any normative guidance from the UN agencies at all. And to me, that's kind of negligent on the part of the relevant UN agencies, because a lot of the things that the WHO has historically complained about or been critical of in alcohol and tobacco policy, marketing, availability, prioritizing private corporate profit over public health, corporate capture, all of that kind of stuff. A lot of that stuff is happening in some legal cannabis markets, and they're not saying anything. There's no guidance on how to do it properly. That just seems like a failing on the part of the relevant UN agencies. Probably not just the WHO. I think UNDP and other organisations should be involved as well. But something to think about for any UN colleagues here or watching online.
Thanks, Stephen. I think that's also an important point that kept coming up from both sides is evidence. We need to go evidence-based. You said before, we need to, whatever we do it right? So I'd love to dive in a bit on that evidence-based. Do we have another question for the audience? I do want to ask, because I do want to leave some room if someone has a question. Yes, please, go ahead in the back. Dominic, would you kindly, thank you. Would you please just briefly introduce yourself and then ask your question? Thank you.
Hi, sorry. My name is Sarvesh Ramakrishnan, and I am part of an NGO from the United States. And one of the questions I had is, I'm actually a college student, a first-year college student. I just turned 18, and I'm from a rural town in Oklahoma. And then I came to university and saw, I was exposed to so many different things. And I sort of saw, the issues that you were talking about drug policy, and these things are right in front of you. So what do you think us as youth should do to become more aware of the issues that we have at hand, and what should us youth do to sort of bring change and bring evidence-based change, like you said?
Thank you. Very interesting question, and I hope you're also going to be there for day 3 for when we talk to the youth representatives. So that is definitely. There's another question. So let's take a second question then.
Yep, does it work?
Jan, very good.
Thank you.
Member states come in, very good.
Okay, yeah, well, great discussion. Thanks very much to Stephen and Regina, and great moderation as well. Thanks. I hope this is not a one-off discussion. I think it's really important to have this kind of discussion. Although, of course, the discussion in the room is the priority as well, to have the voices of civil society heard there. My question is to Regina, and it's actually more or less the same as the question of the previous gentleman, because prevention, and it really links up to the point of evidence base. Many would say that prevention has no evidence base as it comes to drug use, and by youth especially. And I heard several references to evidence-based prevention from both speakers. So I would be interested in hearing a bit more about what interventions could be effective, and maybe examples of what effect has been achieved by that kind of intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan, for that question. And I think maybe, Regina, you can go first and take maybe both of the questions from the young gentleman in the back, also on youth and how to navigate those waters, and then maybe also from Jan, which is very similar in terms of evidence for prevention. Thanks.
Definitely, thank you. I think I'll start with your question about prevention, because it's true. I mean, we know a lot of what doesn't work in prevention, but less so about what does work. The international standards on prevention by the UNODC and WHO have been instrumental in that paradigm shift of moving from these sometimes harmful prevention strategies into evidence-based strategies, because they are, a clear example of what works and what doesn't work. And it's interesting here as well within prevention. Again, most of the research stems from, the US, Australia, and Europe. So we do need a lot more prevention research, and that includes monitoring and evaluation of existing programs in other places outside of these three regions that I mentioned. And that evidence, that monitoring and evaluation or that research needs to be disaggregated by gender, because it's very clear that prevention efforts work very differently for young girls and young boys and people of other genders as well, which is almost completely lacking in research. But when it comes to boys, school-based prevention strategies seem to work well, and for girls, family-based interventions work better. And that means family support systems of, attachment, on positive family parenting styles, on being listened to and have that space in the home. Not only quality time spent with parents or caregivers, but quantity is of importance when it comes to prevention. And in schools, there are very different levels. We have indicative, selective, different, depending on the group. But there we know, and we spoke about this before, what doesn't work is to have law enforcement come into the school and show you a bag of different drugs, like what happened to you when you were in school. And what doesn't work is having people in recovery come in and speak to young school adults. For adults, it works well to have, the stories and hearing the champions of recovery and people in recovery, or people that have had that experience of treatment. But for young people, it's more about strengthening these protective factors, right? It's about making sure that there are enough spaces in a young person's life that will support them from, developing a dependency or other, risky behaviors. The good thing about prevention is that if it's done right and it's evidence-based and data-driven, if we don't have the evidence, we can at least ensure that the data is very localized, in the classroom, the school, and base our prevention activities off of that, and then monitor continuously to make sure that we're not doing harm. And where was I heading with this? It has a mediating factor. It increases school achievement, it increases mental health, and so on. So we still have a lot to do, and I think that's one of the main reasons we need to invest more in prevention and monitoring and evaluation, because we need to see what actually does work so that we're not doing harm. And I know, Matej is one of our biggest prevention champions. You usually say, for every dollar spent on prevention, at least 10 can be saved in future health, social, and crime-related costs. But most recently, there's a study that's showcasing that up to $300 for every dollar can be saved. So it's really a positive result from that work, but it is hard to monitor, right? Because we need to have long-term prevention efforts, longitudinal studies, I can't say that word, and so on. Sorry. And then regarding youth, the most important question of, in any room, how do we involve young people? How do we as, professionals within this space make sure that the knowledge that we have and the outcomes and the learning situations that we've had is passed down to the new generations that can take this forward? That's the most difficult part, right? And that's why young people need to be involved. I've just passed the young person mark myself, so I'm not sure how to do this. But I think, ensuring that young people's voices are heard within these spaces and within civil society, and not having them as a one-off separate entity. We have a lot of youth forums that happen simultaneously, but they're not really invited into the main rooms. But we do have a lot of other, great organizations such as ISUP. ISUP, I think, together with the Colombo Plan and INL, have youth forums every year where you have a 5-day curriculum to learn about prevention, the science of prevention, the policy of prevention, and even how to create projects based on that. And that's one really good way to get into that space. But also for you, you're at school, you're at college, to find those spaces for working together as young people. You find people that share the same values as you, and you can start an organization, you can start a club. College is the perfect place to start, I would say, but it's up also to the rest of us to make sure that young people's voices are heard, because we're kind of the gatekeepers of that, and we need to change it.
Well, thank
Sorry,
you.
I went on for too long, Steve.
No worries. Steve, you happy to also take those questions?
Yeah,
I'd love
sure.
to add one before you start.
Okay.
On evidence-based, doing the right thing, how we navigating with these, when we go new policies, new strategies, when we're saying evidence is the backdrop of, you know, what we're supposed to do, how we're navigating to those new strategies in terms of having them evidence-based if we're going for something new. But please feel free to start with
Okay,
the,
I
with
mean,
the response.
on the youth thing, I mean, it's great you're here. Welcome. We need to have youth voices here. There's a bunch of different youth-based organisations. I mean, certainly in the drug policy, what you might categorise as the drug policy reform space, there's Youth Rise, there's Yoda, there's the Students for Sensible Drug Policy International, chapters all around the world. There is a UNODC youth forum, but it's kind of a bit opaque how you get engaged in it. I don't really know how that works, so you have to ask UNODC about that. On the question, prevention stuff. I mean, there is, you know, there is evidence-based prevention stuff, and I think the UNODC guidance that you alluded to, the EMCDDA best practice prevention portal is another really good source. You know, historically, a lot of prevention has been more politically driven, sort of performative stuff, rather than necessarily evidence-based public health interventions. But that doesn't mean that there isn't evidence-based prevention. I think there's a question about what it is we're trying to prevent. If it's just about reducing prevalence rates, I think we're on a bit of a hiding to nothing. If it's about reducing certain risk behaviours, I think there is some potential. But then the question then is, are we talking about prevention? You know, is the focus on delaying initiation? Is it on reducing risky use? Is it on, you know, what's the overlap between prevention and harm reduction aimed at youth? I think there's a lot of sort of, again, you know, there's a lot of complexity and nuance within the harm reduction prevention discussions that needs to be teased out, and it doesn't really lend itself to kind of, you know, banner headlines like all prevention is good. Obviously, a lot of it's historically been pretty useless, sometimes even counterproductive, but there is also good things. And I think I absolutely agree with what Regina was saying about dealing with the structural drivers. If you know, long-term serious prevention has to address the underlying social drivers, structural drivers of problematic or high-risk patterns of drug use. So again, you know, dealing with you know, inequality, poverty, conflict, trauma. If we're really serious, we need to be looking at longer term. We need to be looking at that, not just not just a policeman going into a classroom with a box of drugs. You know, it's mostly pointless, and the just say no scare stuff obviously doesn't work very well or at all, or counterproductive. What was the other question? Oh, your question.
Yes.
Which was...
I would have come back. On these new, you know, the new strategies that you were discussing before, regulation, legalization, how do we deal with, how do we chart in those water without the evidence?
I think what you need to do is we need to agree on our shared goals. We need to come up with a suite of robust measures and indicators to evaluate policies, and then we need to have rigorous, robust monitoring and evaluation so we can decide how well they're delivering on different outcomes, including health, including criminal justice, including social justice, equality, sustainable development, human rights, and so on. We need to have good data, preferably data that is comparable between different jurisdictions. And that's, again, where multilateral forums like the UN are really useful, because if there is an overarching evaluative framework, like we have within the EMCD, within the EU, for example, collated in the EMCDDA annual reports, and to some extent in the World Drug Report, although it's a bit more uneven than the stuff within Europe. We can compare jurisdictions, you can compare outcomes. And we need to have pilot projects. We need to experiment. We need to be willing to, when things aren't working, to take a step back. We need to be flexible. You know, I'm a great believer in really strong monitoring evaluation with robust indicators and a structured review process for any new legislation. And that includes legalization regulation isn't an end in itself. It's a way of delivering better outcomes. And if it's not doing that, you have to revisit it. if it is doing that, great. Let's share that information, and we can all do it. But or we can all learn from each other. But I think the problem, really, the problem is that we haven't used social policy norms in a lot of drug policy historically, because it's been very much kind of ideologically framed as this kind of good versus evil. We must combat drugs. The stuff that it says in the treaties. The treaties, I think, is the only the 61 treaty is the only treaty of any of the UN treaties that mentions the word evil. It's like Voldemort. It's like Harry Potter or something. We need to get beyond that. It's not that this sort of war on drugs, moral binaries. Actually, there's a lot of nuanced, complex social policy scholarship that we just need to apply to this issue that hasn't been applied to it historically.
And especially evidence, I would say, right? Because
Including
even coming
evidence.
from these two different sides,
but then you get it back into the thing of, well, whose evidence are we talking about? Because you can read one evaluation report on Colorado, and it reads like an absolute hellscape, some kind of dystopian nightmare. And you read another one, and it's like there's little birds tweeting, and everything's great, and it's sort of like, well, actually inevitably the reality is somewhere in between. There's some good outcomes and bad outcomes. Generally, I would say it's been all right in somewhere like Colorado, but there are things they've done wrong, but there are things also in somewhere like Colorado where they've gone, actually, you know what? We got that wrong. We're going to revisit it and tighten up the regulations on packaging, or tighten up the dosage control on our edible products, or change our licensing regime. Regulatory policy can evolve based on evidence in a way that the war on drugs arguably can't, partly because it's not based on evidence. It's a war. We're fighting evil. It doesn't need evidence because it's sort of right on its own terms. But also because it's just never been subject to that same kind of scrutiny that you would many other areas of social or health policy. And the fact that it is now beginning to happen is very welcome. But it's still the case that often it falls on civil society to provide that scrutiny and critique of current drug policy. So like the IDPC are publishing their shadow report tomorrow, an event here, to inform the midterm review. And it looks at all of the challenges identified in the 2019 ministerial declaration and goes through and looks at the data on it, and it makes a pretty grim reading. Sorry, it's no spoilers, but the war on drugs isn't working very well. And it shouldn't really fall to IDPC to have to do that. Really, I think the UNODC and the UNHCR should have done that.
Let me just go back here on evidence and let Regina maybe react on that.
It's a gaps in evidence.
And I think maybe if you do want to also add something on maybe the evidence, because you said we need to go into pilots, we need to say what works and what not works, so we need to take those first steps. What do you think in terms of absence of evidence? Can that do harm if we do something like we had prevention before? If we do not have it evidence-based informed, what can be maybe some harms that we're doing if we're not going on evidence-based? Because you mentioned that before.
I mean, we're not going to have evidence-based on everything, and especially since we do not have evidence for certain regions in particular, for example, where there's been a lack of research or a lack of, I guess, interest from the people that are doing the research. Because let's face it, also research comes from somewhere, and it's somebody funding it, and we can not only use it, to build up our arguments, but we can also do the research itself based on certain, hypotheses or expectations. But in the events that we don't have evidence-based, we can strive to have it evidence-driven. So we can look at what has worked, and we can make sure that when developing a prevention strategy, for example, we can take those aspects that we know and do a very localized data collection. So, for example, a school. How many people, I don't know, do the data collection from there, and based off of that, sit down together and say, what are the measures that we can take on here based on these recommendations from the UNODC and WHO. We have the EMCDDA that has this great link where you can find different, very particular programs that you can implement and contextualize, but also the word contextualization here is of importance, and to make sure that that's done with the local group that is going to be implementing it. So with, mapping the services available in that community, making sure there's community ownership, not only from the people that are living there, but also from the civil society, the school perhaps, the local, public authorities and politicians. And so we can, contextualize these methods, but we need to have that monitoring and evaluation, because otherwise how will we know if we're doing harm?
Yeah.
And that's, something that we need to invest in, both in, planning for activities, but also in existing activities, to make sure that all the projects that we do as civil society, or the policy implementations from local governments or national governments, have that component, and that it's disaggregated by gender and age always, and has a good, research to it.
Thank you, Regina. Very interesting. Steve, I would like to ask you one question, because I'm cautious of time. I know we're going a bit over time, but because you were mentioning also the role of civil society informing member states that things are not working. So I'd love to ask you also, and that's the last question from my side, is so as we're moving to 2024, 2029, what's your vision for the future? A very easy question. What's the one thing you would want to see member states implementing? Maybe, maybe let's not talk 1 year, but maybe a couple of years from now. What's that one thing you would want to see implemented at the global level?
I think I think civil society participation in multilateral forums such as this are incredibly important. I think there's been a contraction of the civil society space in the last few years, which is quite concerning. I think that's a shared concern across all of civil society, including the VNGOC. It's something that they've highlighted. And there's some, I think there's a chapter on it in the IDPC report, which is published tomorrow as well, so people can go and read up a bit more detail on that. So maintaining and fighting for that civil society space for all different voices within civil society, I think is really vital. And I do think that a lot of the positive changes that have happened in the UN, at the UN level and at national level, have been led by civil society. I mean, if you look at the reforms in harm reduction, reforms around decriminalization, the reforms what I think are positive around cannabis regulation, and other positive things challenging some of the more overt harms of punitive enforcement, such as the use of the death penalty and over-incarceration, that's almost all been led by civil society. So we are absolutely vital to holding power to account and making sure that policy does evolve based on evidence and UN principles, rather than just leaving it in the hands of ideologically driven or populist politicians. In terms of what I'd like to see, I mean, I hope that the midterm review is clearly an important moment. I hope there is genuine reflection on the pretty obvious failings on almost every indicator. I mean, when you go through the how many goals were there? How many? 19 or whatever
11
it was?
11 plus 1 on
12.
on data. Yeah.
12. The outcomes on all of them are basically rubbish. And that, given that that's happened, you have to reflect and say something has got to change. Something is wrong here. This policy is not delivering on our shared goals. We need to be exploring options for change. Obviously we disagree on this, but I think that does involve an intelligent discussion around looking beyond prohibition to options for regulation. But it involves a lot more than that. It involves a broader pivot towards a public health and human rights, sustainable development-based approach, instead of this kind of ideological pursuit of drug-free societies and, sort of war on drugs, moral binary thinking that has tended to dominate the debate for so long. And I hope that, I hope that debate around reform, including legalization and including institutional reforms necessary to allow countries to explore and get the evidence and develop evidence and develop best practice and what responsible regulation looks like, can move forward. And that involves looking at the institutions, looking at the UN institutions, INCB, UNODC, the treaty system. These are entities that are clearly in need of modernization because, with respect, they're clearly malfunctioning. Based on the outcomes. If all the outcomes are rubbish and looked at objectively, that is pretty much the case. Not absolutely universal. There's some progress in some places, obviously, but generally speaking, drug-related health harms, drug use, drug markets are all expanding and going up. Drugs are becoming more potent and dangerous. They're becoming cheaper and more available. More people are using them. More people are dying. Drug-based organized crime groups are becoming richer and empowered and destabilizing entire regions of the world. We need, something has got to change, and we need to have an honest reflection and be open enough to explore changes that may seem that are challenging, and increasingly member states are doing that. There are member states who are willing to speak out on this now. There weren't 10 years ago. Now there's a number who are willing to challenge the system, including calling for institutional and treaty reform. And we need to have that debate in these spaces, and I'm very pleased to see that is beginning to happen. So I just want to see more of that, and I want to see open, honest dialogue about the need for reform and what that reform means in practice.
Thanks, Steve. That's a big list to go ahead, but I do see it. So it's civil society engagement, and also basically an honest review of where we stand and to move forward. Regina, this very easy thing, what are you seeing? What are the main elements, what you would like to see going forward?
Well, first of all, civil society has seen a huge backlash in terms of the space in which we work, in terms of the funding available, and in terms of, the credibility given to civil society. So of course that's top of my list as well, to expand that space, to support civil society, and to find ways in which we can, collaborate. Because really, civil society are representatives of the reality on the ground. A lot of or almost all of our members, for example, are grassroots organizations that meet people every day. And so one could learn a lot from how policies are being implemented in place by speaking to them and hearing their opinion. And I think that, Vienna and GLC is a great showcase of how that, link can be made between civil society and member states. And the new African forum to the African Union is another such great example of how we can find ways to collaborate and be able to feed into the policies from civil society. But we need to be listened to, of course, and we need to find ways to work together. And we need a wide representation to really showcase the reality of the civil society on the ground, because again, not all of the organizations in all of our countries are represented on these levels. So we work harder to access that information nationally to bring to the global arena would be a great step, I would say. And in terms of the future of drug policy, I knew this question would come, so I wrote down my answer. A comprehensive, balanced, and coordinated approach that addresses both supply and demand reduction. I thought it was short and concise, and that means supporting a continuum of care. Starting early, working long-term, by investing in prevention and the research thereof, by ensuring that harm reduction is accessible as part of this continuum of care, with the support to referrals into treatment, aftercare, reintegration, and really support these recovery-oriented systems of care, because we do see that people can and do recover, and most of the people that have had a dependency actually do recover. I think from the most recent RecPath survey, it was about 70%, which is a huge majority, and really goes against the narrative of thinking that this is something that we cannot we cannot solve this situation with people with active dependency. And how do we do that? We need to incorporate the voices of people in recovery as well in all of these processes, and championing people in recovery, and supporting the establishment of peer support groups and these communities that create space for where we can, have less stigmatization, less discrimination, and work hard to incorporate, like I said, the recovery-oriented systems of care through, for example, recovery cities, which is a great concept that I would suggest that you read up on, because it's really an interesting model. And I think, ensuring that we continue to bank on the CRC, hold our member states and the people in power accountable for the obligations that they've made in line with protecting children and youth. Of course, ensuring that women who use drugs and women in recovery are giving the same support as men and other people as well, because as we see it now, there are a lot of barriers in accessing treatment, for example, which we can eliminate by strengthening the other social structures, such as childcare, for example. So we have a lot of work to do, I would say. But incorporating civil society is really the first step to getting this broader range or array of input.
So we have a very common goal here of enlarging civil society representation, a balanced support also, and also the special needs of women in that regard. I'd like to just take one question, Steve. You can have another word after, because I thought we have another question. And before we close, I'd love to take that question. Just briefly introduce yourself, please, and ask.
Sure. Thank you for taking. My question is more a comment, or depending on time. My name is Gabrielle Strasky-Pertzel. I'm the Austrian representative for CATFI, Community Alliance for Drug-Free Youth. And, no matter. Steve, you mentioned dosage, and then Regina, you referred to evidence, and both of it is very interesting, because in cannabinoids there are only two substances that are really researched, but 140 are known. So we don't really know what the dosage is that people can buy in the streets. So it's deregulated, but it's regulated, and we don't know where the plant comes from, because the plant draws everything from the ground, from the earth, and we have no idea what to look for. It could be, for crying out loud, mercury in the ground, because if there are big fields of mercury or other pollution in the ground, police puts cannabis there that draws everything out of the ground, and then some idiot, pardon my French, gets that cannabis and sells it. So, there's that dosage that reminded me of that, the word dosage. We don't know what the dosage is, and we don't even know what dosage of what. So I get your idea of deregulation, but on the other hand, deregulation of something we don't even know is highly dangerous. So there's a lot further, and I understand we don't have the time, but I just wanted to comment.
I think, this is a very specific question also, I think, and I think Steve also mentioned in terms of deregulation, there's a lot of evidence we need to do pilot and prototype, but please feel free to respond. Let's keep it short, because we need to
just very quickly. I wouldn't use the word deregulation, I'd use the word regulation. It's deregulated under prohibition in the illegal markets, because you can't regulate illegal markets. The whole point with regulation is you can do things like potency controls, you can test for heavy metal pollutions, and you can have a regulated product. I mean, if there was mercury in the coffee sold over at the coffee stall, if there was, poison in the beer you can buy in the bar in this building, though it would be shut down. Those products would not be allowed. You can regulated products. You can control adulterants and potency. That's kind of the point. So in a way, I think you're kind of making an argument for regulation. What was the other point I was going to make? I can't remember. It was, but anyway, I hope that would be my answer. If you regulate products, you can address those products. That's what regulation's for.
Do you want to add? No, I think you don't want to add anything. No, that's fine.
I mean, I can add. Wow, I can't speak anymore. I hear your points, and I also understand that you are really good at making that into something being used as a positive argument. But again, I mean, the reality of the situation is that in at least a lot of the discussions or the people advocate or the organizations advocating for legalization, with that comes a commercialization and a market that, I don't know how much one can control it. And we spoke about it before. There are different ways. You know, there are the ones where it's more or less of a free market, and ones that are more state-based, like Uruguay, and you know that those differences. But the fact of the matter is that the legal market remains, and so even if you're regulating half of the crops on that market, you're still going to have that risk, and so that's why we would propose to try to prevent from that use happening rather than to legalize it.
And I think on this one we can actually have our own fireside chat on just these different points. And that brings me to it's a wrap for our first session. A round of applause to both of you. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for taking that ride with me. It was our first session. I hope you're going to join us for the next 2 days for our sessions. Thank you so much for coming, and yeah, great to have you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.